4 trans women, Misty, Vicky, Sonia and Simone, are interviewed about their social transitioning, their gender aspirations, their joys, sex lives, and the age they discovered when they were transgender. As footage of drag balls and pageants, reenactments and job roles are filmed, we gain an insightful portrait into the lives of discreet trans women who one day plan to live completely open. This is the short documentary Queens at Heart, directed anonymously and often paired, at the time of release, as part of a double bill with Bob Clark's She-Man, and other films reliant on spinning gender diversity into shock appeal for a cis-normative audience. A fusion of documentary and exploitation filmmaking itself, Queens at Heart earns recognition beyond the typical genre of cross-dressing schlock, frequent in this cinematic period due to its genuine earnestness, offering an educational insight into the lives of 4 pre-Stonewall trans women, a representation that was truly scarce. While the film certainly contains outdated language common at the time, we'll get to that in a moment, the film presents tender portraits that remain relatable and relevant due to their experiences reflecting the common experiences of trans women today, from gender dysphoria, sexuality, and the anxiety of being trans in an unaccepting world that encourages people to hide their truest selves. One of the first aspects viewers will recognise about Queens at Heart is that it is a product of its time, a time capsule that iterates limited language and understanding of LGBTQ+ people. The film sits in an odd contradiction of being conservative in its ignorance and yet sincere in its willingness to learn more. Queens at Heart would be produced at a time that the mostly cishet crew didn't know of the correct terminology, plus the language hadn't adapted to encompass how we understand gender diversity today, when referring to the trans women at the centre of the film. Often these women are described as drag queens, or as feminine gay men, which we now understand not to be the case. Gay men and drag queens wouldn't answer the questions on gender identity in the same way that trans women would, from discomfort with one's own gender to the aspiration of living full-time as a woman. While some drag queens can be trans, and some trans folk may have begun their rainbow journeys as cis-gay people, what we see within Queens at Heart is an example of the interviewer and filmmakers being unaware of how best to describe these trans women to an audience of mostly cis-normative people with zero knowledge of this way of existing. There is an honest misguidedness here that both demonstrates a lack of knowledge on the subject of transness, as well as providing a simplified, diluted point of reference to understand for an audience curious to learn more. There's something admirable about the naive understanding of trans women here, while other films aimed on shocking audiences with the depiction of gender diversity for scandalous effect. After all, cross-dressing was deemed a felon at the time, and for many ignorant viewers, they would view cross-dressing as synonymous with transitioning. In contrast, Queens at Heart is very clearly curious about a way of living that was so often ignored, that was so often discreet and away from prying judgmental eyes. It's a curiosity that remains significant, as this film serves as a documentation of the rare transgender representation dated before the raids at the Stonewall Inn, a warming, strong educational resource for those fascinated by LGBTQ+ history. While the celebratory nature of the pageants and dancing looks wonderful, where a range of queer folk are enjoying their freedom to be themselves, expressing their identities in peace and safety, the central focus of Queens at Heart are the interviews. As the interviews delve into gender dysphoria, sex positivity, and the anxiety of hiding one's true self from an unaccepting world, Queens at Heart expresses empathy rare towards queer folk at the time of its production. As a side note, the relatability of this film speaks volumes, as many of the experiences and issues these trans women face are still common experiences the trans community face today. From feeling unsafe in public spaces to the challenges of accessing gender-affirming care. While this film remains a significant piece of earlier transgender representation, the key lesson to take away from this film is that there is still much work to be done in creating a fair society where people don't feel afraid to exist peacefully as their truest selves. In conclusion, Queens at Heart is a time capsule of the ignorance towards anything diverging from the conservative, cis-normative expectations of 60s America, and while its language and attitude is outdated, there remains an earnest curiosity to learn more about trans existence. A misguided attempt to learn more is always an improvement over an outright hateful unwillingness. Strangely apt in its conversations on common trans experiences, Queens at Heart remains a significant lesson in LGBTQ+ history for those fascinated by trans voices in the time of trans erasure, and what we can learn about the progress, or lack of, in the fight for trans rights. Watching these women express their hopes and dreams for a comfortable life, it's hard not to wish and hope that these women had happy lives long after the cameras stopped rolling. A special thank you to my incredible tier Patreon supporters Gil and Jared Spears of Concessions, as well as my super tier Patreon supporters Spodzilla and Audio Casey.